Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you for being here today. Let me follow up a little bit on the sanction business, because, you know, I guess the question is, a couple of questions. One is, do you really believe, you mentioned that the other, we lifted the nuclear sanction, but we haven't lifted the other sanction. And it seems like the only reason that they came to the table, we kind of put the nuclear sanctions on them, that really wrecked their economy, and they came to the negotiating table. So you just have to wonder, do you think the non-nuclear sanctions, the ones that are left there, are they really going to have any kind of impact? Because if we talked about it, it doesn't seem like they're doing much. We're talking about doing things and designating things, but it doesn't seem to change the behavior. And on the snapback provisions that you talked about, I wonder if you really believe those things are going to work, because on one hand, you'll have a lot of little small incremental violations that won't trigger the nuclear sanctions, and they'll just kind of nickel and dime along the way, and all of a sudden we'll wake up, the international community will wake up and realize it's almost too late to stop. And the other part of that is, do you really believe that companies believe in these snapback provisions? Because would it make sense if you really believed that these provisions are going to snap back, and you want to do business in Iran, and you knew Iran was in the business of doing bad things and violating treaties, et cetera. I mean, would you really want to go in there and do business, start doing business in Iran, knowing that these sanctions might come back into play? Wouldn't you kind of avoid that in the long run? Talk a little bit about those two things.
Congressman Crenshaw, both of those are, I think, excellent questions. And I'd say that with regard to the nuclear sanctions versus the other sanctions, while we had the toughest nuclear sanctions, the toughest sanctions regime that we've ever put in place with the world community, Iran was still able to fund terrorism. They were still able to fund regional destabilization. So there was leakage even with the nuclear sanctions, because not everything comes through sanctioned entities and not everything can be stopped with sanctions. Our goal is to make it as hard as possible for them to do those activities. I don't believe the shape of the resources they have for those activities will change dramatically, but we shouldn't kid ourselves. Even with the nuclear sanctions, they were finding ways to support terrorist activities. So we have to keep on it. We have to be attentive to any entity that we can make it harder and harder for them to work through. But if you look at the nuclear sanctions, it was a case where the world community came together and said, on some things we don't agree, but on the question of should Iran have a nuclear weapon, there was total agreement. That was why that sanctions regime was as tough as it was. And when Iran agreed to roll back its nuclear program, there had to be a rollback of the specific nuclear sanctions. We have never rolled back the non-nuclear sanctions, and we will continue to designate under them. On the question you asked about the snapback and the willingness of companies to do business, there is not a rush of companies and financial institutions actually executing on doing business. We have made it clear where the nuclear sanctions were lifted. We would not be keeping our agreement to say that it was a violation of our rules or laws if things that are not sanctioned become the basis for doing business. But there has been a reticence in the global
You
community.
think that's partly the threat of the snapback?
I don't know that it's a threat of the snapback, or if it's a threat that because there's enough other malign activity going on that there's more risk with Iran, or if it's because Iran has conducted its business affairs in the world that make it difficult to rebuild those normal business relations. What I can say is we have an obligation to keep our part of the bargain. We have to lift the nuclear sanctions, which we've done. We have to make it clear we're not going to take action under the nuclear sanctions. And then businesses, financial institutions will have to make their own decisions whether they want to be in that market. But I don't think we ought to be suggesting that, that the nuclear sanctions continue to be a barrier. And we've been clear about what sanctions remain in place. We have a website that's very clear. We answer questions all the time. If you believe in sanctions as a tool for affecting change of policy, malign policy, you also have to believe in relief from sanctions when those malign policies change. In the case of the nuclear sanctions, they worked. In the case of these other things, we have to continue to be on the case. And when we see entities that are involved in supporting terrorism, we have to be willing to continue to act against them.
Well, I just hope, I think it's a great concept if they really believe that they're going to snap back. I think we need to make sure we're vigilant and don't let them just kind of ease along and wake up one day, but say.
If they violate the nuclear agreement, the snapback would kick in. They haven't yet.
Great, thank you.